welcome to this talk. My name is Bjørn Jacobsen. I was supposed to have been here last year and do a similar talk, but that kind of missed out. I received an email after having talked to my daughter saying, why are you not in the room giving the talk? And that was kind of weird. So last year was a disaster in that respect, but we decided to do it again this year. All right. So who am I and what do I do? My name is Bjørn Jacobsen, like I just said. I work on a video game called Cyberpunk 2077, which is mildly awaited in the industry, apparently. I make both asset creation, implementation. I am a senior, which means that I also have a say in our audio direction, how we deal with things, and so on. Apparently I did a good job with footsteps on my previous video game, which was Hitman, which they liked so much, so I'm totally in charge of footsteps on Cyberpunk. That's the highest echelon of sound design. No kidding, it's really cool, but it's just, I got a little tired of it at Hitman. I worked on Hitman. Before that, I did EVE Online, and apparently I liked space stuff so much, so I had to go back and do Cyberpunk. We worked on an MMO called The World of Darkness, which got scrapped after 7 years of development. 600 people, 7 years of development, scrapped product. That was a disaster. Anyway, I wrote a thesis in university. I finished it about 2 years ago. That was after several years of having postponed it, but it came out. I wrote about, I called it Informant Digests in video games. It's mostly a giant rant against every professor and lecturer I ever had because they were theoretical and they didn't know how things work in the real world. So we had a long argument about it, but it's about how to use sound as part of information, part of a gamified object in your video games that you can use to communicate with players with, and how to enable or interact with players rather than using UI design, graphical design, things like that, like sort of like a different path to things. And mostly this information is actually more important to level and game designers to know, because they often tend to not know that sound is an informant that can be used. We had lots of arguments while working on Hitman that, let's say we had noisy elements in our game that would be noisy, but we weren't told in the sound department that this was a game mechanic they were going to use. So they made this icon with a noise thing in it explaining that you're now doing something noisy, and we in the sound department said, why don't we just make it noisy? People will know. We can make it hence the name of the talk, Game Audio Gamification. We can gamify the audio of our game so that like the audio in itself becomes a game mechanic that people can play with. And of course the obvious question then comes, then what about our deaf players? And can't really use that for anything. Just, I'm sorry, deaf people, I'm sorry, but we can't take them all into account. Anyway, this really long thesis, it's about 100 pages long. It's very dry. So this here is going to be the not so dry explanation of how this works. So we want to, and by the way, just be prepared for really high level slides, animations and stuff. It's good. So it's important to understand that video games are interactive art. If you see it as an art form like that, especially as a sound designer, you can sort of understand the mechanics going on between sound and player, communication between the game and the player. It's not because movies are bad and because linear media is bad, it's just a different way of approaching the same thing. Through my years in the industry, I've sort of witnessed a lot of both sound designers, but also level designers, game designers, and people coming from the movie industry straight into the game industry, thinking that sound and cinematics and so on needs to be created in a linear way, put into a linear game, even though it's played back in a different way in a video game, then sort of not understanding or at least realizing the hidden potential of what interaction can actually do. So in some of the video games I've worked on, we have decided to sort of take it further and try to gamify everything that's going on in the game, so that you theoretically could play the games with your eyes closed. Not that we want that. It's just a way to go. One of the things is also that sound is I know this guy who does biology, and he explained it to me, that sound is an active sense and seeing is a passive sense, I think. Or maybe it's the other way around. But anyway, sound, your hearing works all the time, which your vision doesn't. Like, you can still hear in your sleep, you don't see stuff, things like that. And our brains do subconsciously constantly pick up information about what's going on in the world around us, even though we are unaware, meaning that we can have sound in our video games that will obviously maybe be super subtle, but our brains will take note of it. So if we sort of, gamification is such a buzzword, but we can sort of like gamify every game element in our game to guide players in certain directions, have them do stuff, prevent them from doing certain things, which might be a good thing for us. I'm gonna scroll here. Yeah, so playing a video game is basically like, I think I've described it as like, it's like a long wordless conversation between man and machine. The machine simply just picks up everything you do and responds with graphics and sounds. But you need to understand that the sound that's coming back, you can manipulate whatever's coming back to the player and then have the player react in certain ways, or maybe feed them information about what's going on. Like in Call of Duty, the only indication of that you're about to die is that the screen becomes blurry and the music becomes muffled. They don't need a UI icon saying you're about to die. So I tried to explain it to some people at university, but also at some of the companies that I worked at before, that we create leitmotifs of game mechanics instead of having UI elements like constantly fatiguing the player with visionary fatigue that something's going on. Skip. There you go. Right. So these are some of the most common communication models there are around. These are probably invented back in, I think, in the 40s when it came to telecommunication, but that's a different thing. A monologue is like linear media, like a movie. Like there's stuff and it's presented to the player, or to the audience. But dialogue is what's going on. So like I said before, the player does stuff, action happens, computer thinks and responds. So we have like this constant conversation going on between player and machine, which of course, if we gamify the stuff that's going on, we can alter the response and have the player do stuff that we want them to do, or simply make it part of our game that this is what they need to respond to. Like, a lot of games already have this, but maybe it's not put in on purpose. Like Batman Arkham Asylum, there is actually a small whoop sound every time your combat combo ends, which means that if you actually close your eyes and just press the button every time you hear that sound, you can win every opponent, beat every opponent. I don't think that's there purposely for that, but it works. So you can actually do the most difficult fight with your eyes closed. Same thing goes for The Last of Us. In The Last of Us, they have this really, really nice way of doing it. There's a tone in the background which represents the amount of vision that the NPC has on you, which means that when you're sneaking, you can basically just close your eyes and listen for the noise in the background, and you know they're about to see me. You don't need a massive UI icon or an arrow pointing in some direction about where it's going on. We did the same thing in Hitman, where there is a noise, but we also had a UI icon pointing. But if you upped the difficulty, all the UI would be gone. So you could basically also play the game, not with your eyes closed, but you didn't have to worry about where is the opponent coming from, because if you knew the level inside out, you could just listen for when does he see me, and then you can hide. So we have a gamified audio element there, which makes the player play differently or change their behavior. And we're moving on here. I called them direct sound informants. Well, sound is a direct informant. It's vital game information, just like the NPCs who's about to see you. There's like a direct informant about something that you're supposed to do. It creates almost a small meta game of audio where like with your eyes closed, you can play the game. So one of the things that we did, I had a problem with one of my previous games. I worked on this, it was a small indie MMO called EVE Online. It was there we had this problem that most players, for some reason, are really proud of, that they play the game without sound because they don't need it, they say. And we had a problem with that because we wanted them to turn the sound on. So an idea that we as a team found, but I ended up implementing it, was why don't we make it a tactical advantage? Like, you can hear what type of gun is my opponent having, what type of armor does he have, and what type of ammunition is he using, or the other way around, what type of defense do I need? If we make that a tactical advantage, will players then understand it? And we had metrics saying that we went from 30% or something of players playing with sound up to about 75 when we implemented that feature. So players apparently did turn sound on once it became their like last resort of information between life and death in EVE Online. And EVE Online is serious business when it comes to their players. So this here is, this is the animation part I was talking about. Two spaceships. One guy shoots the other. And we have an impact sound, and he has thermal protection. He changes his ammo and then fires a different type of shot, and this guy over there dies. Wow, victory! But that was what we did in EVE Online, and it made people turn the sound on. We did some other things where it was possible to also passively listen for, did someone enter my space system? Which means that you didn't have to play with like 9 clients turned on at the same time, hide players around your space system. You could just hear subtle sounds when players would enter the space system. So you could now, like, not passively, we didn't want people to be AFK, but that meant that just by listening, people could now listen and be aware of their surroundings. We sort of argued with management that we would make it into a serious game design element, that listening was now a thing, instead of just watching for graphics all the time in there. But you can also make a passive informant, which is just as important, but let's say it's responding to parameters that we don't necessarily have control of, or which are unimportant, like time of day or music that plays differently after you've played the game for 8 hours. It's completely insignificant to what's going on, apart from that it changes your, let's say, your current experience that's going on. If you win 2 battles in a row, the music is more uplifting. Yeah, sure, that might change what's going on, but it's not a game changer like so. It just makes the game more rewarding. So EVE Online, we had nobody with sounds on. Combat sounds that suddenly created an advantage. We gamified the combat that made players turn on the sound. We also had a problem with people had multiple accounts running, which also, so we made it sort of like into a game object where you could suddenly control which sounds do you want. Not like you can turn the music down or something like that. We made, like a full-scale 2-page slider thing where people could turn on. I don't want to listen to the spaceships. I don't want to listen to the combat. I only want to hear warnings and wormhole activations and so on. Like super detailed. So that people could play with one account in one way and another account in a different way, so that they could listen to one account but combat and fight with the other one. Because that's what EVE players do, have lots of accounts. I had 8 myself. So, and we had a mini game in EVE Online it was supposedly possible to complete it regardless of skill. Of course, that meant that you had to retry it if you were low skill. So if you went to a tier 5 puzzle and you were only level 1, it would be more difficult for you to complete it. It was theoretically possible to do it. So what we did was that we created a thing where you could, just this typical little hacking game, where you click nodes and you're supposed to find the correct node with the center server, the main server, to complete the game. Like kind of like whatever hacking thing there is in almost every modern game. But if you moused over the nodes that you had not clicked, there would be a small radio noise in the background, which would be a specific type of noise calculated on the what do you call it? The amount of the percentage chance of this being a good or a bad node. So theoretically, you could hover over all your options and then actually listen for which one of these should I click if you had 3 options. It didn't give away which one was which, and we didn't tell the players in the beginning. So after 2 years after implementing this, suddenly there was a guy on the forum said, "Hey, I found out if it's this sound when I'm playing this type of game, suddenly I can click the right node all the time." And we were like, yeah, great. So we didn't tell the player. It was a hidden feature, but it did make it possible for players to do it. We had in Hitman the same thing. Originally there was only a visual indicator that an NPC was spotting you. So we changed that and made noise that was changed directly in pitch and everything depending on how close they were to you. Same thing as I talked about before as in The Last of Us. Which means that there are some scenes in The Last of Us, but also in Hitman, that if you know where the enemies are and you need to do a specific thing when the enemy's in a specific location, you can calculate. You don't have to look at the player to see that he turned around and now sees you from a distance. You can turn around yourself and then hear, oh, he turned around, because now the warning of NPC vision is playing. Gamification is a lot of things. It does also occur in real life. It's not necessarily gamification, and gamification is a stupid buzzword that they love at university. I just prefer to call it that. You can cross the street as a blind person because you can listen for small clicks at the traffic light. Beep, 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 beep. And then there's a green light. And that's definitely a so-called direct informant, as I told you about before. You can check if a wall is hollow or not by knocking on it and then figure something out. That could easily be implemented into a video game. Like you click with your mouse somewhere, and if it's a specific type of noise, you go through there, or that's the option that you choose. That's exactly the same thing as the hacking thing that we actually made. Sort of like figuring out where to drill your holes in your wall. Move on. Yeah. So musical gamification. We did composition and player progression, which is in level design, they call it weenies or landmarks, like they're in specific places. Like a weenie, I think it's a Disney term, like the castle at Disneyland is placed in the center of the park, which means that you can always look up and then see where is the center of the park. That is a weenie of Disneyland. So you can basically make, we did that for Hitman towards the end, tried to make the music, if you were going in the right direction, the music would sound in a certain way. If you were walking in the wrong direction, it would sound in a different way. Sort of like trying to guide the player into what's going on. It's of course a very simplified version of super linear music of how it was going to be. But if you knew how the system worked, you could listen for, did I do the right thing, almost before you did them, because you could listen to the stinger that played when you entered the room. And it's the same thing goes when, let's say, we've probably all played Skyrim, and in Skyrim you can hear the combat music turn on. Maybe you don't see the enemy, but you know there is one. And you start spinning around until you see the red dot on the directional meter, so you know where to go to kill people, because that's what we do. And yeah, they call it level design and weenies in landmarks and weenies in level design. So in some of the games that we've been working on, we also tried to create we call them audio weenies, just to go along with their lines of how to deal with it. And by having, let's say, a really annoying sound playing in the areas where we didn't want the players to go, or a really rewarding thing to play in the areas where we wanted the players to go, so that we could sort of like guide the player in the right direction, sort of like gamified that they could know the right thing to do, and then in the end of the game they will all think that we figured this out ourselves. They don't know that they had been guided and handheld the entire way, but that's players do like hand holding these days. So combined, because we don't necessarily want sound to take over and visuals to be completely scrapped from our video games. It's just more that sound can be used as a tool for this just as well as visuals can, which is often a problem at probably all the games I've ever worked on, that stuff is being put into the game, like with the Hitman one, where they wanted a game mechanic about noise, and the only way that they could think of representing that was by putting in a UI element instead of talking to us, and we could make a noise mechanic that could something do the same thing for them. Yeah. In the thesis, I tried to explain to lecturers, readers, and whatever, that video games and game audio is one giant earcon. If you don't know what an earcon is, it's described as wordless communication, which is, I mean, it's a fairly good broad term that you can use. Every game mechanic can have its own little leitmotif, like it's not about the enemy approaching, but it could also just be you're about to die, you need to do something else, you need to change your player behavior in order to win this, and so on. There are a couple of examples. In LA Noire, there's a piano chime when you're standing close to evidence, and there's a piano chime that changes. It plays two different ones depending on did you make the right or the wrong choice. There's the whoop noise in Batman Arkham Asylum, Papa Sangre. That's an audio-only game, which is not exactly what I'm trying to achieve, but Papa Sangre is pretty awesome. Like if you're into sound only, yeah, you should definitely try and play that one. It's just don't do it on the plane because the noise of the plane will probably ruin it for you. And The Last of Us, the percentage of the cone that's going there. But also in Overwatch, where every player has a unique footstep, you can tell which player is where, who should I be afraid of, where should I go, things like that. That also happens a little bit in Counter-Strike, where there are certain areas of a game where you know that there is metal footsteps. So if you are a really good camper, you can camp in places, and you know when you hear the metal footsteps, then after 3 steps you can fire your gun because you will then hit them when they appear in the door. True camper story here. Almost every game mechanic and element can be linked into sort of like a game audio gamification thing. Everything can be iconic and an earcon or have a leitmotif attached to it. I'm not saying that it should, but it should be considered. At IO Interactive, we had this before the season 1 that we released a year ago. We had this creative director who he didn't care about sound himself, but he was fully aware of that any game mechanic, any game object, or anything like that should at least have a checkbox of graphics, gameplay, and audio, and which meant that everybody was made aware of how things are, how they're supposed to work, so that you could make a choice that there is this game mechanic, how is it working game mechanically, but how is it also working with sound and everything like that. So everybody was told early in production that this was going on, so that we didn't have to deal with it after like a month before release when they found out that something wasn't working. So yeah, and that's game audio gamification. Thank you. And there's a bunch of usual standard answers if you want. Any questions? Someone.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I have 2 questions. Well, actually, it's like 2 parts of one question. But for example, when you took the example of Skyrim, like you do know that you're in combat before you're in combat because the music starts. But sometimes when I was playing the game, I found this actually was kind of a flaw because I thought, oh, there is somebody behind me, you know, just turn, fight, whereas would have been maybe more fun to just be attacked in the back without knowing it, like in real life. So how do you really like find a balance between things that audio should highlight to inform the players and when it shouldn't actually.
I think in Skyrim, I mean, all Bethesda games, they're really good, but they're super buggy and things behave in weird ways. So I think if you ask them, they would have loved to have been like you just said, where the element of surprise could come up and you could be attacked from behind. But I think their setup, there must be something about their setup which just turns on the combat music whenever there's an enemy present, which is, I mean, in some situations nice, but I think your solution would have worked better. But I think that's an engine limitation or a limitation on their behalf.
Yeah, probably. Or they should have worked on that specifically to avoid like...
yeah, but I mean, also Morrowind, which is before Skyrim, is probably the most perfect example of a video game which has the most perfect music you can find with the worst implementation on the planet.
Yeah,
that it doesn't work at all. It's a great game, but yeah.
And second part of the same question is because giving too many informations to the player can be confusing. So
yes, of course.
How do you find a balance between what you really want audio to tell the player and what is less important? And do you have a system that like prioritizes certain sounds, and maybe you can give that information in a certain context, but in another you don't? Or do you go into that kind of stuff?
Yes, because we also want to avoid too many sounds.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a little difficult because, of course, I'm not interested in players having listening fatigue and then turning sound off because we're too noisy. I am primarily interested in from a game design perspective, the understanding of that you don't necessarily need fat UI icons all the time to show you stuff. You don't need in level design only a common thing is to have light shine upon the doorway that you're supposed to go through so that you visually can see where to go. Like sometimes it becomes a little too obvious if it's visuals only. Sometimes you could dim that down, probably make the experience better if you had a noise or a sound that guided the player instead. I think it's more like in game studios, especially for game and level designers, they need to start to understand that this is a possibility that they have and understand how sound actually works in an interactive environment, because I experienced way too often that they do a level and they do their game design and so on, and then they have problems because suddenly there are too many UI icons or something that doesn't work or so on. And then when they talk to me, they tell me they have this problem. We want to guide the player to there, but we can't make it work. It's like we can add a noise. And they're like, will players notice? Yeah, of course they will. It doesn't even have to be very, very aggressive. It can be super subtle. And that's... it happens in a lot of games already, but I've never really seen game studios who actively thought of audio as a complete or as a way of communicating with the player. It's more like game audio has always kind of like been seen as fluff. Maybe not between game designers, but with audio designers, it's not. But with game designers, it's quite often just seen as something that's just there to complete the experience, which I think is a very linear movie way of thinking about it. Like we're only there to support the mood, yeah, but we this is interactive art. We can be our own thing. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So.
One question I would have is that the LDs can put a light. The LDs can't put a sound. How could we give the LDs the tools so that they don't feel obligated to stick a candle on everything that you're supposed to go to, but instead use a sound?
Yeah. Most game offices, they have Skype for Business, and you write, "Can I have a sound here?" Or like make it part of the planning process when you design the level, the basic schematic.
You need to have a sound guy,
yeah, like
in the same room.
We did with Hitman before we all were made redundant about 6 months ago now. We made a new rule that instead of whenever they made levels and and elements and so on, we would always hear about, we made this new mechanic, or we made this new design, and there's concept art for it. And we raised our hands and said, why isn't there concept audio or concept level design? Like, why isn't there a concept for this? Because we then experienced sometimes that they would then go ahead with their concept art, do the thing, and then implement it, and then for some reason it gets lost in production, and then we're told about it about a month before release, like, okay, there is this thing. So we took it further and made and requested that whenever you have concept meetings, we want a sound designer present to just raise their hands if we believe we can support what you're trying to achieve. And it worked really well. But yeah, sound designers need to be part of that process, because of course they can make a tool where a level designer can add a sound, but I don't want level design audio in my game. So more?
So if you have audio that's like 3D audio that's a really central mechanic, and maybe there's like a weak or non-existent visual component with it, how would you account for the variable audio setups that the consumer has? Like with 3D audio especially, you'd like to hope that they have headphones on, or you know, so.
No, I usually think that players have the worst setup imaginable, like mono and a distorted, broken speaker. Just simply because I've realized that as much as I would like everybody to have a 7.1 Atmos thing, or even more at home with super hi-fi things, that players just don't have that. So we, as much as it would be cool, I don't want to, like in the concept meetings, if we would have those, I wouldn't bet on that we should make it too 3D placed in the world. I think it would be cool, but it wouldn't work, because then I don't know, 99% of your players wouldn't have that set up.
So you would kind of shy away from making it a vital mechanic, assuming that.
Yeah,
like,
I would always assume that the players don't have the crazy setup that we would like them to have.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
More? All right. Thank you for coming.